Any Tweety people, if you want to use, there's a hashtag. You want to use our hashtag here. And what I'm going to talk about is how we do good work with Agile requirements. And this has been a quest of mine for many years, going back to the late 90s when I first started working with Agile and iterative development practices. Okay. So let me also mention, I'm going to give away a copy of Discover to Deliver, the book that I co-wrote with Mary, and we have some other goodies to give away. We're going to be doing a couple of different things. We're going to have some polling activities. We're also going to do some work in teams. So I'll be putting you in teams of 4, ideally 4, so that we can think a little bit about going deeper and more holistically with those things that are called user stories. So now the next thing I want to do is find out who's here in terms of the primary discipline or work that you do. You know, popcorn popping up and down. What I'm going to ask you to do is roll your chair back just a little bit, because I'll ask you to stand if the answer to my question is true for you. Okay? So I'm going to ask you if your primary discipline and responsibility is product ownership. Would you please pop up? Product ownership. Discipline of product ownership. Okay, just a few product owner. Okay, thank you. Development and architecture. Architecture and development is your primary discipline. Devs, architects. All right, thank you. Testing, QA. Testing, quality assurance. Welcome. Awesome. Business analysis is your primary discipline. Just a few people. Okay. You're a Scrum Master or Agile coach. Wow, look at that. That's our majority of folks here. All right, thank you. Product. Or sorry, you're not product. I mean project manager or portfolio manager, regardless of what setting. Okay. All right. Thank you. Who did I miss? What discipline might I have missed? Anybody? Yes? User experience. UX. Thank you. UX. UX. Okay. All right, so that's an interesting mix of people that we have here. So, you know, we can all agree that the goal of Agile is to discover and deliver a high-value product. And by product, I mean a software application, system, or device containing software that provides value to customers and business partners, right? So it can be something that's intangible, wholly intangible like software. It can also be a system that contains software and hardware. How many folks here are working on products that are tangible products, like medical devices or physical devices of some sort? Anybody here? Just a few of you. Raise your hand. Okay. All right. So we know we have these ongoing activities of discover, deliver, discover, deliver. And the idea is that we want to do these activities as quickly as possible. And when we do them, as we discover, we put items in the product backlog. And the backlog contains the potential product items that we need to build to get to value. And you may use stories. How many of you use stories as the items, the primary items in the backlog? Okay, so that's like most of you are using stories. Some of you may not use stories. You may use one-liners, or you may name things as features. And you'll notice that the backlog items can be of different sizes. You could have chunky items, or you could have more thin sliced items in the backlog. So let's talk about this idea of backlog refinement and the idea of done. And I'm going to have us look at the Scrum Guide. And the Scrum Guide says that the product backlog items that will occupy the development team for the upcoming sprint are refined so that any one item can reasonably be done within the sprint time box. So we have those words refined and done going on. The product backlog items that can be done by the dev team within one sprint are deemed ready for selection in sprint planning, in a sprint planning. Product backlog items usually acquire this degree of transparency through the above described refining activities. So we have this idea of refining and done. How many of you, if you have a definition of done in your work today, assuming you're using Agile practices, could you stand? We have a definition of done in my work. Wow. All right. For those of you standing, just stay standing for a sec. I'm surprised that, are you surprised by how many folks are standing up? Anybody? What do you notice about the folks standing and sitting? Any observations? What's that?
It's all the Scrum Masters and coaches.
Scrum Masters and coaches, that's an interesting, yeah, that's probably true, yes. Okay, so what's an example? Anyone, put your hand up so I can get your focus, everyone to focus. What's an example of one of your definitions of done on your team? Anybody, raise your hand. Just one example. Bram?
Running in production.
It's running in production. Thank you.
Tested.
Tested. And do you have a delineation by what tested means?
Well, they got different testing from UAT testing or
Could be different levels of testing, and you specify those. Yes, okay. You had one, please?
Demonstrated.
Demoed. It's been demoed.
Deployment plan.
Deployment plan exists. Thank you.
Tested, defined unit test coverage.
The unit test coverage, it has been tested according to unit test coverage. Okay, those are great examples. Okay, have a seat. So I'm going to look at some examples in a minute, but what we're talking about are done are the conditions that indicate the backlog item is completed, accepted, and potentially shippable. Doesn't have to have been shipped, but it's potentially shippable. So here's some examples of a definition of done. That the backlog item has been developed, unit tested, demo, and meets the conditions of satisfaction. That the item can or has been delivered to the customer. That documentation and release notes have been approved. Does anybody have, those of you that stood up, do any of you use any definition of done around documentation? Yeah, okay, that can be very important depending on your product and your market. Regulatory and some of the products that I've worked on, regulatory documentation, really, really super important. Okay, did you have a question, Joel?
Actually, just as part of documentation, one of our teams just ran into definition of done didn't include updating lists.
Definition of done didn't include?
Updating lists.
Uh-huh.
That became illegal.
Okay. So you have to be clear on what the documentation is. You may have to list that. The code's deployed to a specific server. There are no level, whatever your levels, that would be significant defects that exist. That it's been accepted and integration tested, and post-deployment customer feedback is ready to go. So we can get feedback to validate that we actually built the right thing. Okay? So those are some ideas of definition of done. Super important to have. I mean, this is probably one of your big leverage points in improving your work, is being very clear on the definition of done and evolving your definition of done over time. So when we talk about refinement, we're talking about getting those backlog items, whether they're stories, and that's what we'll talk about tonight is using stories, or something else that needs to get to done. So we have the idea at the top of that box, that's the product, and we have a vision and our end game, and that's clear. We know what the vision is, what our goals, objectives, our metrics, our outcomes that we expect. We have clarity around that. And our backlog is filled with items that may be chunky items for a longer time horizon, what we like to call the big view, regardless of Agile method, this works, this idea of you have things, the big view, those are big chunky boulders, if you will, in the backlog. And then we have turn the dial on our telescope, and we see rocks that are coming up for the preview, like at a release level. And the smaller items for the now view, right up close, those are our pebbles. Those are the items we're going to build to get to done for the next sprint. Or if you're using Kanban, though, that's your work in progress, your WIP. All right? So you want to have this chunky, lumpy backlog. Now, the high value items that you need to build for the next sprint need to be prepared. They need to get ready to pull into the sprint so you can get to done. So tonight is about how do you get those items ready, because sometimes we run into some unpleasant surprises. And see if you can relate to these. These are just a few. Traveling stories. You know what I mean? Not the story of the traveling pants, not that one. But the story travels from sprint to sprint, iteration to iteration. It doesn't get done. That is most likely an indicator that that story was not ready. Or your estimates are wildly off. Or you're spending a long, laborious, troubled, boring, difficult time in planning. Probably those items were not ready. And then, of course, you could also have a really bad problem where when you do your validation, you check, and that's not even what the customer wanted. It doesn't meet business goals and objective. It's not what we needed, not ready. Because, of course, we only want to pull in valuable items into the sprint. Anybody relate to some of those things? I know I have. So when we think about refinement, why do we do it? Well, we need to get everybody on the same page with a shared understanding of the whole product, and for the parts and pieces that we're going to deliver for the next sprint, what is entailed in that. We need to understand the why. Who is involved in refinement? Well, I think there's three parties. People from the customer perspective, the end user perspective, and ideally we have end users involved with refinement. Sometimes you'll have somebody that represents the voice of the user or the customer. That might often be a product person, a product owner, or product manager. Okay? We need that voice. We also need the voice of the business. Okay? We have subject matter experts. They may understand rules and regulations. They understand value that makes the product viable. Often the product person is also playing this, or represents for sure this perspective. And then we need the voice of technology. All the people that build, deploy, test, support, document, train, etc. on the product. We need representatives from all three voices. So this is not just about a few people. Right? The most effective refinement is engaging representatives from those different parties. So what is it the work they're doing? Well, what we're doing, you know what refinement is. We're moving things up and down in the backlog. We're slicing them. We're visualizing, specifying, evaluating, exploring, removing. Things are constantly in movement as a result of refinement. And of course, we're also estimating and sizing the items in the backlog. The outcome of refinement, then, is a lean and lumpy backlog. A lean and lumpy backlog. And a backlog that has highly cohesive, loosely coupled items. Okay? And anybody using scaling? One of the scaling methods, anybody using scaling? Anybody using large-scale Scrum? Les? You're familiar with Les? Ram, you gave a great talk a few months ago about that. This work of refinement helps you understand your requirements areas. And that same concept applies regardless, really, of what scaling approach that you take. Okay. So why is it good? Well, it's going to optimize collaboration because we're getting the right people involved. And it certainly presents waste. You know how much waste those traveling stories causes. Lots of rework. So we want to have a smooth flow as we come into our iterations. Another really powerful benefit, this is unbelievably powerful and exciting, is that it increases the domain knowledge of the team, right, and of the whole ecosystem involved in building and deploying the product. And also, Jeff Sutherland's done some research and has a study published about velocity. Using velocity as a metric, it can double a team's velocity. When the team really gets things ready, right, things just flow through very quickly. And, of course, it helps you get to done. So this is all good stuff. So let's think about this. Let's take an example of a story. And let's say the story says, as a concert goer, I want to use dining discounts so I can enhance my concert experience. So do you think that you would, as a developer, as a tester, as a coach or scrum master, do you think that the team, as a product person, as a UX person, is the team ready to pull that story just like that in? What I want to ask you to do is form a group of 4 people. And we're going to use this group in a little bit as well. And looking at this story, formulate what are some of the questions that you have about this story that you would need to get answered in order to actually create, build it, and deploy it. Okay? So groups of 4. Turn around, form your groups, please. Just going to give you a couple minutes for this. Okay, question.
Yes. Okay. We had many questions listed out, but the first one was location, where, date, and time.
Location of what?
Concert.
Okay.
That's kind of going to determine the next set of questions as to what kind of dining options we have, what are the discounts available, and how is it going to enhance our experience.
Wow, you have a lot of questions. That's more than one question, but certainly your first question was around the data. You had questions about the data around the concert.
The date.
The date of the concert. So what is the date of the concert? Because the date, the location, and the time. All right, thank you. Pat? Okay. Next question. Who else had a question? Go ahead.
Well, one question we have was, what does dining mean?
What does dining mean?
Well, define, clarify dining. Do the discounts apply to the booze? Food?
Does discount apply? We know where your mind is. Does discount apply to the booze? He wants to know. Okay, what kind of concert is it? What else? Other questions? How do you want to get the discounts? Somebody that has the mic?
Describe concert experience.
What does concert experience mean in terms of the value?
Over here. What's the business model between all the different companies, the dining and the entertainment?
Wow, you're looking at the big business model question. What's the relationship between this company that's building this and the restaurants? So if we took that story and we did some more work around it, and we said, well, we're going to transition that story after refinement so that it reads something like this. As a super fan concert goer, okay, so now I have an idea of the type of user, I need to search, that's the action they're doing, for concert-related dining discounts. Okay, so that's the data they're looking for. And the benefit is so that I can enhance my concert experience. But I also had conversations so I know what rules, what business policies are going to be enforced. That is that only members can search. And only active dining discounts can be searched. So I understand the controls that are constraining the behavior. And I know the information about the platform, the environment of use. Okay, it's going to be built on iOS, Chrome version 5.0. And I know my interface is around searching and querying. And availability needs to be 95% of the time. A little more information? Helpful? I'm sure you still have some questions, but is it still refined and ready? What do you think? Okay, there still may be more that we need to discover and refine about, but it's a start. It's a start. So I want you to notice that I use some color coding here. And around the edges are some images that represent the 7 product dimensions that we need to discover about any backlog item, right? And we're going to be able to use those dimensions to refine backlog items at any planning horizon. Big view, preview, now view, right? So the 7 product dimensions, I'm going to go through these quickly. Then I'm going to show you an example with this little baby case study. And then you're going to do some work to see about your understanding of the questions and answers these dimensions can provide you. So the user dimension are people, systems, and devices that interact with the product. Okay? They connect to the product in some way. Interfaces are the means by which those users connect to the product. The actions are the behavior that the product provides. Now notice that these are symbols. We use symbols and colors semantically. Okay? So action, green, footprints, you get the idea? Then we also have data. We act on data. That's the important data or information that is stored in the product, that persists in the product. And there are controls. These are business rules or policies and regulations that constrain those actions or enforce rules and policies in the data itself, such as, for those of you familiar with the idea of referential integrity. Those are about controls. And then we have the environment of use. And you'll notice, what is, looking at that image, what do you notice about that image? What does that look like to you? Can you see it from your purview?
Package.
There's a package, there's a box representing the product in the middle, and then what's around it? A vice, exactly. Constraining the product. So this is going to be your technology platforms, hardware and software platforms. And for those of you building physical products, these are the component parts of the product. And these are often given to you, given many of you work for large organizations, and you have a technology architecture document that tells, these are what we build on this platform, these browsers, this middleware, these are the DBMSs that we use, database management systems, and so forth. But we need to know what is the environment of use. And we have quality attributes. These are the items that qualify the product's behavior. These are things like performance, little things like that. Security, usability, right? Availability, testability, and so on. Those little things, right? I call these quality attributes the last child on the playground to get picked. Because we too often forget about them until we get to the, some teams have an unfortunate thing called a hardening sprint, also known as hair on fire sprint. And that's usually when they're doing their performance testing and other quality attributes. Oh, we forgot about those. Yeah. So so these are the 7 dimensions. And for those of you that have a background in requirements engineering and business analysis, you may be wondering about the F word, right? Functional and non-functional requirements. Well, they're here, but they're shown holistically. So the functional requirements are user, action, data, and control. And the non-functional are interface, environment, and quality attribute. All right? Well, what we want to do is look, I don't really care. I mean, I care, but I don't really care about functional, non-functional. Who cares? As long as I understand that backlog item holistically. And I've had conversations to think about what are the possibilities, what are the options, and which ones are high value, okay? So that's what we do by looking at these 7 product dimensions holistically for any backlog item. And we explore and evaluate options. Those high value ones assemble into our stories. So we want to have conversations. We know that face-to-face conversations are ideally the best. Sometimes we can't always do that. Conversations are really, really important in doing our refinement work. But not just any old conversations. What I found is we need to have structured conversations. And all this really is, a structured conversation, is a metaphor for this ongoing collaborative way of exploring and evaluating and confirming options along those 7 product dimensions. So that's what it is. We explore, we take some starting point. It could be an existing feature, it could be a vision, it could be some idea, it could be a story. And we look at options within and across those 7 product dimensions. And because we want to slice based on value, value becomes our slicing mechanism. So we take a subset when we evaluate of the high value options, and then we confirm, because you're not done with the conversation until you confirm that we have a shared understanding. And this is where verifying through acceptance criteria and validating post-deployment becomes really important. So this is just a metaphor for the type of conversation, right? So the conversation goes around all 7 product dimensions. Now, what we do in practice to have good conversations is we put those 7 dimensions up on the wall. We call it a discovery board. And we've been doing this for many years, and we find that it's incredibly powerful. And you'll notice that when you look at this, you can't really tell who's who. You know, we have a product person there, an analyst, 2 testers, dev. You can't tell who is who. Everybody's engaged in this conversation. Now, what I want to do, and there's a shot of a wall, a discovery board from a client engagement from last year, what it looks like afterwards. Notice that we do find that using the colors semantically helps so that people don't have to remember necessarily the name of the dimension. Well, isn't it one of those purple things, we'll hear people say. Okay? So let's take an example. I'm going to run through an example with you for our little case study called Concerts for Me. And this is a site that you can go to follow bands that you really love. And the bands and the promoters also use it to push out promotions. And a product person at Concerts for Me has a brilliant idea of a new initiative. And that is that we're going to partner with restaurants who want to connect with us, C for Me, our little app, for folks that want to attend concerts. And they'll get discounts. And it'll be a win-win, and we'll increase our revenue. And they've done some research, and they found that the restaurants are indeed interested in that. So you'll notice that that's related to the story that I showed you before. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to take an example. Now, this slide shows what a discovery wall, or elements that would normally be in a discovery wall. With the left-hand side, we call it discovery board. The left-hand side has all the kind of why and who stuff, the value stuff. We're not going to focus on that tonight. We're going to focus on the middle stuff, right? This is our example. So I'm going to show you an example taking that center portion where we're doing optioning within and across the 7 product dimensions, okay? And so we'll have a board that looks like this. And what I'm going to do is show you how you would explore options and evaluate for high-value options. The examples that I'm going to show you are going to be mostly in text, but oftentimes we use visual models. That really enhances the conversation. But for our example, let's give this a try. So we said we have the user dimension. And the users interact with the product. And we have a great product person who's really smart and has done some analysis and has developed some personas and understands that we have super fans and soloists and dedicated and tag-alongs. And I want you to notice the super fans tend to be more engaged and more social. And they have people that often follow them. Now, if you were thinking of who you would focus this capability for, this ability to be able to do discounting, who might you focus on? Who would be the most valuable of these personas? What do you think? Yeah, probably the super fans, right? Because they'll bring other people, say, hey, let's go, let's go after the concert, let's get together, or let's meet before the concert and have dinner and a drink and that kind of thing, right? So they would be the most valuable user, most likely. So we go to our options board. we have all of the possible options that we listed them here, the dedicated soloists, etc., of the different types of C for Me members. We just put a star to indicate that's who I want to focus on. But we explored and we evaluated based on value, right? So now we think about actions, the capabilities that the product provides. And maybe we'll build a story map. There's other visual models that you could use, but in this example, we say, well, let's do a story map of all the possible things that could happen in this experience of being able to get these discounts. Searching and downloading and telling a friend and etc. And the product person decides, you know what? Searching, finding them, that's what I want to definitely have you focus on, team. So those are starred and show up on the discovery board. And so we see that searching is valued. Now, just as an aside, in practice, you probably have that storyboard under there, or another wall pointing to that, under that action dimension. Okay? Then we think about data, the information that the product is going to store. Well, what are the possibilities there? Well, we are going to use a visual model here. The tool already exists. This app for C for Me exists. So we already are storing information about artists and members and concerts and venues. But for this capability, there's going to be new data. What do you think that new data is?
Restaurants.
Yeah. And what?
Discounts.
I didn't hear what you said.
Prices.
Prices would be attributes, right, around the discount. Exactly. So like the price is a 20% discount for this restaurant. So we know we need this other data because that's what we're going to be searching on, and then we have new data which will have attributes, right? So on our discovery board, we are going to just list those in a text format for now, for demonstration purposes. And then we think about controls. These are policies, rules, and regulations. And let's make it easy, and let's just list these possible ones that we would have. That includes anyone can search. No. That's not going to be a rule that we'll enforce. But only C for Me members can search. And only active discounts can be found, right? Because you don't want people finding discounts that aren't active, and so on. So we focus on which controls are necessary for this capability. And what's our environment of use going to be? Well, we have some possibilities. We can interface. We can have an environment including Facebook, iOS, Chrome, etc. And we decide iOS and Chrome is where we're going to use for this initial release of the feature. And then we need to know the interfaces. And we know that this discount feature has to interface to the member, and it has to interface to the restaurant site. Those are possibilities. These are just options. The high-value options that we're just focused on right now in our conversation is around searching, right? So we're probably going to build some kind of user human-computer interface. It doesn't have to be, but it most likely would be. And we put that on our discovery board. And then we come to quality attributes. Now, what I'm going to show you now these are the possibilities for quality attributes. This is a meta model, a model of a model, if you will, of the possible quality attributes. And some of them are around operational quality attributes, and some of them are around development quality attributes. And we're thinking about this, this searching and downloading and these possibilities, and we want to have high availability. We need to think about interoperability with our restaurants and with being able to pay, the restaurants paying for the discount, even being able to do the discounts, and have high performance and usability, because those restaurant managers are super busy and they're not going to spend any time if it's a really crappy interface and if it's really, really slow response time. So they're all kind of important, but we can't have everything at once. So the most important one that our product person decides is availability, right? Because they know the restaurant manager profile enough to know that they're probably going to be doing this really late at night or at mid-morning, depending on their cycle of their restaurant. So now we put those options show up on the options board, and we put a star next to the high-value ones, okay? So we've had a conversation where we explore options and we evaluate and subset the high-value options. And so we come up with the story that looks like this, that we saw a bit earlier. So, a little more ready by doing this kind of work, a little more refined by asking these questions? Yeah, what do you think? All right, so what I want to have you do now is I want you to dig into these 7 product dimensions and questions, all right? So I want one person from each team. Some of you had teams of 5. If you have a team of 2, I want you to be in a team of 4. So, so I have enough cards to go around. Can I have one person from each team stand up, please? Let's just take question number 1, and then after this, question 1, I'm going to have you shuffle them a little bit. But let's just take question 1. And what does question 1 say? Are there properties that qualify the product's operation and development? What dimension does that card go with? Which dimension answers or asks that question? Quality attributes. So move the card under quality attributes. All right? Now, what you do, mix up the question cards, read them, and figure out which dimension asks that question. Okay, go. I'm going to give you about 10 to 15 minutes. Okay. So, wow, you guys did a great job with that. Some of you got much further along and almost were finished with the decks. I didn't expect you to finish them all. Yeah, there were a couple of, there was a boo-boo in there. There were 2 cards that were duplicates by mistake. There's another that's similar. But let me ask you, what questions did you have about the questions? Question, David?
Are there right answers, or is it a matter of judgment where one can justify different answers?
Is that a meta question, or is that about the activity? The question was, are there right answers, or do you have the question about the matching activities?
Yeah.
Yes, they're constructed so that they do go in one place. There are questions that I'm sure you noticed that seem like, that kind of sounds like, it's about something else. But in the end, in the intent that I had, was that they all land in one place. Yeah. Question?
We had 2 number 35.
Okay. That was a sorting error at the printer. Apologies.
Okay, those are 2 different.
So, aside from the boo-boos and the little cards, let's talk about the content of the questions. What strikes you about this exercise? What did you notice about doing this exercise? What cropped up for you?
The collaboration between the team members.
The collaboration between team members that you needed to do to answer the questions? Yeah. Is there more? Pat?
Yeah, and I think that I was really struck by how it could really support alignment between stakeholders and powers that be and the people doing the work, so that there really is clear alignment on, and as clear as you can get on this overall thing before you get started.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you for that observation. Other things you noticed?
Clarifying boundaries between what belongs to which category
Clarifying boundaries between what belongs to which category.
in the 7 categories that we have, and that helps us kind of lay the foundation towards how we are going to approach the solution.
So it helps you lay the foundation by being able to answer these questions across all 7 dimensions. Absolutely. Great. Thank you. Anybody else? Yes, please.
I think for us back here was sort of like agreeing on interpretation of the question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
So for us back here was agreeing on interpretation of the question. So
Okay.
different skill sets. I was like, well, I think that means user. I think it means this one. So
Okay.
yeah.
So there's some learning there about the
Yeah.
meaning of the question. Could you give us an example? Might be handy here. What?
I think interface for us was one that we were trying to figure out, well, who triggers it? Is it really the user? Another question that we actually had was
What?
the data. It was a data question, so who triggers, does that question go into?
Which was,
data?
could you read the question, please?
Okay, so what triggers the product to take action?
Okay.
So yeah, what?
So what?
What?
And there's a who. So the what question is about action. So that's what is the event that triggers action and who triggers that? So those are two related questions. Well, one tells you user and one tells you action. Yeah, right. So they're intertwined, aren't they? These questions, which really brings up another very important point when we, do this work. When we do this work, we notice that the 7 product dimensions thread together. You ask a question in one dimension and it uncovers information and asks questions in another dimension. So I literally make that analogy of multicolored threads as the colors, right? So you may ask a question about user, and I take this question and it made me ask who does that action, and that brings me over to the action dimension. And what data do they need, and what's the environment of use? So in practice, it's very fluid. You don't step them through. I was kind of like playing with you by doing that example and marching through the dimensions. You do need to control and facilitate the conversation, but it's actually very fluid. Okay, so a couple other things that I want to make sure to share with you. The idea is that we are slicing for value. So you've looked at these options, and we use value as the slicing mechanism to pick a subset of the high value options, right? So we're not splitting using some arbitrary, there's various mechanisms. People talk about steps and so forth. This is more strategically slicing for value and looking at each of those chunks in the backlog, whether they're stories or whether you want to call them something else, looking at them holistically using those 7 product dimensions. And we assemble the high value options, okay? We'll come to questions in a second. And you'll have multiple backlog items from doing that, all right? So the question now is, are you refined and ready? If you've had this conversation, exploring and evaluating. And just briefly, I'm going to say, well, not quite. Because you still need to confirm. We need to confirm to learn. And this is about verification and validation. The conversation isn't quite over until you do this confirmation. And as Brian Merrick said, a very powerful tool is using examples. An example would be handy right about now, he said. And so many of you probably are familiar with this idea of a scenario, which is an instance of use, and taking a concrete example. A scenario then may give us an example, or you might start with an example and have a set of examples that map up to a scenario. Those examples become tests. So you could see that you could start from the example and aggregate a set of examples as scenarios, or you could say, let's take some scenarios and have some examples, and those examples are going to grow up, become teenagers and mature adults, and become tests that are actually executable. And some of you will use tools, I think, behavior-driven development or acceptance test-driven development tools like JBehave and Cucumber and so forth to do this work. So a scenario, just an instance of use, for example, searching for a nearby restaurant, or searching for a locally owned restaurant, or by cuisine. So refinement is about knowing the whole story, exploring the 7 dimensions of each backlog item or story, and also supplementing it with scenarios, examples, and tests. And you'll have analysis models. You don't have a whole bunch of them. You have the ones that make sense for that particular product domain. And they help you model because they help the conversation. You model not to document. You use visual models to enhance understanding. Whether you decide to retain them because they're going to be useful as product documentation or as part of handover, that's another story. That's a decision the team would need to make. Right? So when we look at the stories more holistically like this, we have something that can turn into an executable and enabling specification. Enabling specification is a term of art from the Patent and Trademark Office. That when you submit, does anybody here have a trademark with the Patent and Trademark Office? You submit for a trademark, you have to support it with an enabling specification that tells you how it could be exactly reproduced, using that specification. So refinement is about understanding the whole story. And here's an example of perhaps some criteria I like to use. Valuable, actionable, and feasible. A refined backlog item or a ready backlog item is valuable. I mean, you certainly don't want to pull it in unless it's valuable and everybody understands that it's valuable and it's aligned to the goal of the sprint if you're at the now view. And it's actionable. So we've explored those 7 dimensions. We understand acceptance criteria. They're totally unambiguous. This is where the INVEST criteria are also important. Independent, negotiable, estimable, small enough, and testable. Okay? And it's feasible. I mean, the team can build it. They have the skills and capabilities and tools at hand, and they can build it in that sprint. Now, you may have your own. This is my example of like a sample set of this is what it means to be ready. And some teams that we work with find that it's helpful to have the conversation about what is ready. Okay? So in some cases, some backlog items might need to have something like a wireframe accompanying it. Or in some situations, we had the data model on the wall, and we would circle the entities and add attributes on Post-its that were going to be new, because data was so important in the team's understanding of that particular product. So refined and ready. So I'm going to now go through very quickly some real examples. Those won't show up on the videotape in the end because this is some real stuff. I'm just going to go through quickly just to give you a flavor for what these sessions look like when we run real discovery sessions. So let me take a couple of questions and then we can wrap up. Did everybody hear the comment? No. I think of the product person as the person responsible for finding stories and making them ready for the team to work on. I don't agree with that. I believe that it's a collaborative work with the product, the representatives from the customer, business, and technology, that it doesn't fall to this one person to do, that everybody needs to have a shared understanding, and the engineering, the product team, the engineers, the testers, can and should challenge the product person based on where we want to go with the product. So I see it, at my experience, has been it's much more productive when we can collaborate around that.
So assuming 2-week sprints, how often would you go through this discovery process?
Well, you do refinement, so the question is, if you have 2-week sprints, how often would you do this? Every team has a different cadence for when they do their refinement work. And if you're in a large-scale situation, if you're in a large-scale Scrum or whatever, your scaling method of choice, the cadence might be slightly different. Some teams will do their refinement work when work in progress lowers. Some will have a scheduled, twice a week. They'll do some of their refinement work, and you want to have backlog items ready for 2, maybe 3 sprints ahead. Okay. So each team will find a different pattern.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Okay. So if you go to the website for the Discover to Deliver book, discovertodeliver.com, there's a whole bunch of assets, and you can download all those images, a discovery board kit, and so forth. So please feel free to do that. All available under Creative Commons. Okay. All right. Thank you for that.